talking about how kids are struggling during the pandemic, and some of the kids will say that they are feeling anxious. I'm really worried about getting sick, or they can articulate what's going on for them, and so then the parent says, oh, my child is worried, and it's very easy to figure that out. Other kids are more of a challenge. Some kids are just mean. They're mean like junkyard dogs. They're irritable, they're fighting with their siblings, they're fighting with their friends. And it can be really confusing as parents because our kids are always changing, so they're moving targets where we're not sure, like, is this kid depressed or is this kid just not super nice? And we have this private conversation with ourselves. I would say, as a general rule, when a child is super irritable like that, it's a good idea to check and see if there's a mental health problem, because very often the kid is depressed. What depression looks like in kids is irritability. So like a fluish kid, just cranky, and dissatisfied. It's not like adults who are having a beer or a glass of wine and crying and talking to their friend or pouring out their heart. They're not naming the problem and talking about it. Their kids are just grumpy.
How young can parents pick up on these symptoms? How young of the child's?
Well, we have patients come in as early as 3, which sounds really odd, but we have a super art therapist who works with littler kids, and the littler the child is, the more you're relying on like art and play and working with their parents. But a really common thing, Marty, that kids are coming in with is refusal to go to school, because and a child who used to love school now won't go. That's not right. So then we have to get that sorted out and get them back in school as quickly as possible so they're learning and socializing, right?
That's great to know. Yeah.
And that's part of the challenge, is that often the behavior that's a manifestation of the underlying mental health problem, the behavior is just, not a behavior we can tolerate. Like, our kid has to go to school, or the kid can't be punching his brother. So it ends up, essentially you're disciplining because these behaviors cannot be tolerated, but we're missing the underlying problem, which is the mental health.
And that's great to know, because a lot of parents can just be like, well, he's just sort of rough with his brother, or well, he's just always kind of cranky, right?
Right. And oftentimes it takes, like, this art therapist that we work with, who's incredible. It takes someone like that who's sort of the whisperer, and who can interpret this medium of art and really recognize this is how they're expressing what's going on, and the underlying problem is sadness or anxiety or rage, perhaps, about some sort of thing happening in the family system.
Dr. Von Hippel, you had touched on therapy services that can be involved early on. So can you tell us a little bit about the difference in what a speech, occupational, and a physical therapist would provide for some of these children that qualify?
So speech therapists, physical therapists, and occupational therapists really deal with slightly different things than what we deal with as psychologists. Sammy, we were looking at this together. So speech therapists look a lot at just saying the words, articulating words, which makes sense. But they also work on something called pragmatic speech, which is just kind of psychobabble for reading body language. And it turns out that with some kids who have developmental delays, they're not hardwired to read body language correctly. And so, so most kids, if their teacher's like doing this with their hands on the hip, they know, like, ooh, I need to cool my jets. She's looking a little hot. But kids who don't read body language, they're blind to that information, so they can't change their behavior accordingly. So as you would imagine, they get in a lot of trouble. So speech therapists teach kids who don't read visual cues. They hear the words, but they're not reading the visual cues. They teach them to join those things together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and occupational therapy is more focused on activities of daily living. Can a child eat properly? They can do feeding therapy where they expand a child's diet. Can they tie their shoes? Can they put their coat on? Can they do what we would expect of their age cohort? And it really helps them function in a classroom if they can keep up with these independent living skills that are appropriate for their age.
occupational therapists also deal with this domain called sensory processing disorder. And these are kids who are excessively reactive to everyday sensory stimuli. So, going to the gym or going to the cafeteria is pretty gross. It always stinks. It stunk when I was a kid. It stunk when you were a kid. It still stinks. It will always stink. But it won't annihilate us. We can go in there, right? Some kids will feel like they're going to vomit because they feel the smell so strongly, and the sound is so much that they get sort of panicky. It's like all of the senses are turned up and are on the highest volume, and it's very overwhelming. And people have different sensory profiles, but occupational therapists work to kind of blunt the intensity of that so that children can participate in the world without struggling.
Just to touch on that, when my son was recently diagnosed with ADHD, he was referred over to an occupational therapist. We noticed initially we would feed him a few types of foods. Well, my younger son, I don't like it, We'd feed him the same thing or something that he didn't like. He would run through the house like a crazy man. I can't believe that. I mean, it was, like you were saying, overly sort of sensing, that he doesn't like this.
Yeah.
And it was obnoxious, really. And that was like that was one of the first symptoms that were like, okay, well, maybe he's just, doesn't really like cottage cheese. Okay, But it was the start of something that helped kind of guide us to seek professional help. So.
And that's a really good example of the importance of collaborative care, because often something like sensory processing issues also involves an element of anxiety. Like, it makes them anxious to go into that gym. It makes them anxious to sit down at dinner and not know what the texture of the food is going to be. So in a collaborative team, the occupational therapist and the child psychologist can come together and say, okay, I'm going to tackle the anxiety element of this and help this child to regulate in the moment through anxiety management strategies, while the occupational therapist works in their clinic to systematically expose them to different types of food or different types of auditory stimuli.
A physical therapist, I'm assuming, works on more of global balance, sort of coordination. Maybe you can elaborate what a physical therapist would do for a child?
Yeah, mobility and gross motor. And for some kids who are just poorly coordinated, it's a big problem when they're in a gym class or when they're trying to participate with their same age peers in a game of kickball. Shoring up those balance skills.
Especially important with kids with central nervous system disorders,
Absolutely.
right? So they have high tone, difficulty with feeding, standing, etc. Yeah.
Kids who are recovering from injuries, ADHD kids will fall out of windows, break wrists. I mean, they're often very accident prone and need some help recovering.